Hello and welcome to the Badass Unicorn Summer Series, a programme of intimate conversations with some of my most badass friends. This series aims to provide honest, motivating and no-nonsense perspectives from people who've been there and muddied the t-shirt to inspire your personal development journey. I've carefully selected a set of aspirational guests who've done some amazing things, but who I think we'll find are very much just like you and I. Through their stories and wisdom, I hope you'll find pertinent nuggets which will fuel your growth and help you realise your dreams. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my next podcast guest, Sarah Ellis. Sarah is a co-founder of Amazing If, a training and development company on a mission to make careers better for everyone. She's the co-host of the UK's #1 career podcast, Squiggly Careers, with over 2 million downloads, has delivered a TED Talk that's been watched by millions, and has released 2 Sunday Times best-selling books. Cool, eh? Personally, I have a lot to thank Sarah for and count myself lucky to call her a friend after we met volunteering 8 years ago. It was actually one of Sarah's fledgling courses back in 2015 when Amazing If was still a passion project that formed a huge part of my discovery of the magic of personal development. She and Helen, her co-founder, are massive role models of mine, and it's been beyond amazing to watch them take the world by storm. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Alice. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Thank you for joining.
I should hire you as my PR person, I think, based on that introduction.
There you go. Everybody loves the intro, don't they? A little bit of like ego stroking.
Well, it's a snapshot of all the best stuff with none of the bad stuff. So we'll talk about the bad stuff together instead.
We are going to talk about the bad stuff because that is so important. All right. Well, why don't we start before Amazing If began? Could you tell us a bit more about your career up until that point?
Of course. So my career was mainly spent in very big brands that lots of people will have heard of, Barclays and Boots and Sainsbury's. And I loved it. I loved working in big organizations that had lots of people and could have a really big impact, and a really positive impact. I kind of believe that big organizations where they are values led and act responsibly can make a really positive difference to the communities that they're in and the work that they do. And so I really enjoyed it, and I got no aspirations. It certainly wasn't part of any career plan, or perhaps talk about why career plans are not that helpful anyway, to run my own company. And I was always in marketing, so I wasn't in learning and development or in career development. I enjoyed ideas, and I still enjoy ideas, and I enjoyed creating. And I think when I was first in organizations and trying to figure out where I might fit and what I might enjoy, I was always any role where there was just space to do something new. And I've got a real track record of doing jobs, roles, or being in teams that haven't existed before. And so sort of my squiggliness internally was always about looking for something that probably was, even at that point, not that ladder-like. I was always interested in like, oh, there's a new change or a new team or a new opportunity. No one quite knows what it looks like. They were like, I was like, oh, that sounds good for me. Lots of people didn't like that ambiguity, but I always quite enjoyed it. And I think I was lucky enough in those organizations to work for some very brilliant leaders. And they have been really, and continue to be, because I don't let any of them go because they're all so great. I make them stay in touch with me. They were a really big part of my career and my career development. So whether it was almost spotting my potential before I did, supporting me to do things that I didn't believe I could do, giving me the confidence to do jobs that felt really ambitious, saying it was okay to be ambitious, which that took a little while for me to figure out. And so I think probably my first 10 or 15 years in my career were just about exploring and experimenting within very big structures, about jobs that I was doing, learning from some brilliant people, and also working with some brilliant people as well.
Amazing. Yeah, I remember when I did your fledgling course and you talked about 2 things that kind of resonated there. One, you did the corporate affairs job, which wasn't like your typical marketing role. And that, as you talked about, is kind of example of the squiggle and doing something new and trying your hand in a slightly transitional sort of role. And then I remember when we were doing the values exercise, and you were talking about, is ambition one of your values, or is it growth or progression? I think it is. And you almost achievement, that was it. And you almost being a bit uncomfortable with that value for quite a while.
Yeah, I think because I once was told I was too ambitious, so that wasn't that helpful. And I don't think that was the right thing for that person to tell me. I think he was a bit uncomfortable, probably, with how driven and ambitious I was. And so for a while, I think that sort of put me back in my box, and probably meant that I didn't kind of walk quite as tall for a bit. And and I think I'm naturally competitive and I am driven. That isn't just in my DNA. And I do think your values can work for you, and at times they can work against you. So I think I had to figure out, what did achievement look like for me in work, and not to achieve at all costs. And I think that was partly about letting go of comparison, which is still something I find hard. And I think it's even easier than ever to compare yourself to other people and other people's careers, because it's all over Instagram, it's all over LinkedIn. And I do find it difficult to sometimes not look at something and think, oh, well, why are we not doing that? Or we should be doing that. But my co-founder, who is very wise, has a brilliant phrase where, and she's also not like me, which is helpful. She'll just be like, it's all about running your own race. You've got to like focus on your own game, sort of almost like compete versus yourself. And I think that is a much better approach to your career. So when you stop worrying about what are other people doing and who's getting promoted before you, or what jobs are other people doing, or all those things, which I think are really natural. But if you can let go of that and think, well, I'm the one who has to turn up to my job every day, and I'm the one who's kind of living my career. And if you can figure out what matters to you, what feels motivating for you, you can start to make, I think, braver choices. I think I started to make some braver choices in my career that were the right thing for me, and maybe even looked like madness to other people, or they were like, wow, I can't believe you're doing that. So to give you an example, for a few years I worked a 4-day week at Sainsbury's so I could spend a day on Amazing If. But I say I spend a day on Amazing If, it wasn't even a business. I just spent a day doing other stuff, really, stuff that I wanted to do. And that felt like such a luxury, and it was so unusual. No one really worked a 4-day week at that time. And you could see people thinking, oh, well, does that mean she's opting out of her corporate career? Which I wasn't. I was just as motivated as I was previously. I just wanted to do something a bit different, a day a week. And I don't think I would have been brave enough to have done that earlier in my career, because I just don't think I knew myself well enough. I hadn't got that self-awareness. Whereas I think as I sort of understood myself better, my strengths and my values and kind of what motivated me, I thought, I know that's the right thing for me. And hey, if that means I'm not promoted quite as quickly as some other people, I'm kind of okay with that. Or if that means I make a decision where I go and do a job and hey, it might not work out because nothing's ever certain, I'd rather try it than kind of not try it. So I think that was a really important point for me in my career, is kind of letting go of comparison and starting to use my values. We talk about values as a bit of a career criteria, and I think that's definitely what they've been for me.
Amazing. I think I'd love to talk a little bit more about the comparison stuff that you were talking about, because if anybody doesn't know who Sarah is, she's pretty damn successful. And I compare myself a lot to her and Helen and the business that they're growing. And I'm sure there are people who are comparing themselves to me. And I guess it surprises you when you look at your role models and you find that they've got just the same sort of challenges and they're working through the same confidence gremlins that you talk about as everybody else.
Yeah, and I think it's attached a bit to status. So Will Storr wrote a brilliant book recently called Status, and sort of the status game. And it's how we form our identity in terms of, how do I figure out whether I'm, I don't know, winning at life, whether I'm sort of in inverted commas successful. And I do think in previous, certainly, you know, more ladder-like careers, and we kind of talk about this move away from kind of ladder-like careers to squiggly ones, but in ladder-like careers, success and status was so defined by, you know, where you were on that career ladder, you know, how quickly you were progressing, how far and fast you were kind of moving up that ladder. And so that, for me, career ladders felt like a very natural, comfortable place, because that's competitive. That's one person wins, another person loses. You know, that's a very clear framework for a formula to succeed. So I just thought, oh, well, that's what you've just got to do. Like, you know, having started work, I was like, and in corporate structures, you know, there's a fair bit of hierarchy, and it's kind of quite easy to fall into that trap, I think, of thinking success equals how far up the ladder I go. And again, I think that then encourages you to compare yourself to other people. And also, I've done things that encourage you to compare yourself to other people. So I did things like graduate schemes. And as soon as you do that, you're part of a cohort where you can't help but think, but you're, you know, how am I doing versus that person versus this person? And a few times in my careers, I've done things where development programs or various things where it sort of puts you in a situation where you have to be very confident to decide to let go of comparison. So I think some of it comes with experience, some of it comes with just self-awareness. And it doesn't mean that now I don't ever compare myself, but what I try to do instead is a helpful reframe, which is curiosity over comparison. So if I see someone else doing something and I sort of recognize that I'm sort of falling into the comparison trap, and I think it is a trap, I'll just sort of think, what can I be curious about? What brilliance can I borrow from them? How could that be helpful for what we're trying to do? And I think previously I might have been too influenced by doing too many different things in too many different places, being like, oh, we need to do a bit of that and a bit of this and copy this person on this thing and do that thing. And then I think you have to just create the space to figure out, well, certainly when you're running your own company, what are you trying to achieve? How do you want to show up? What do you want to be doing? And then, of course, learn from other people, like steal like an artist, and take all the amazing stuff that other people are doing, because like, why wouldn't you? That's a smart thing to do, but you don't have to do exactly what other people do. I don't think it's about imitation or comparison or copying. I think it's much more about, as you've described, sort of taking inspiration and then sort of going, well, what does this mean for me and for what we're trying to do? And I think then you can sort of let go of that idea of thinking all of my identity is potentially then caught up in things I can't control. And I think that's quite a dangerous place to be.
Yeah. I think there's 3 points I'd make. I think one term I heard from another sort of coach in our space called Kirsty Hulse is, think about people being ahead but not better. Just because somebody might be ahead of you in your eyes doesn't make them necessarily better than you. There's also that concept of proof it's possible. So if I want to do a TED talk one day, I could look at you and Helen and say, well, look, there's proof that this can happen. Somebody that's not too dissimilar to me, who started off with very humble beginnings as well, has managed to achieve that. So actually, if they can do it, then why can't I? And then I think the third thing, which is actually a piece of wisdom that you gave to me when we were at the Albright Club, it must have been about 4 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, when I was still quite early on in my journey. And I remember being like, I think you were offering to help me with something. And I was like, yeah, but we're kind of competitors, I guess. And you were like, well, we are if you see it like that. But if you see us as all making the cake bigger rather than the cake being finite, then if we're all growing the cake, then it means there's more cake for everybody. And if we're all after the same thing, which is democratizing access to personal development with slightly different lenses or guises, then actually we're all helping each other and we're all hitting the same goal, which is helping people to become more self-aware, have happier careers, live more fulfilled lives. And something that I think about now is, let's say somebody likes Britney Spears, right? If they buy Britney Spears's album and they go to a Britney Spears concert, well, they might also like Katy Perry, and they might buy Katy Perry's album, and they might read Katy Perry's autobiography. So actually, if you think about the fact that these people aren't just in silos of only watching listening to one podcast or following one person on Instagram, and think about the collective, then actually that becomes much more freeing, which is maybe a bit more difficult in that hierarchical setting of career ladders where there might only be one job and one person going for it. But generally, it's never that finite, is it?
No, and I remember, I think early on when we were starting, certainly when our first book came out, Emma Gannon very kindly had me on her podcast. Now, she had very little reason really to say yes to that. Her podcast was way bigger than us and her profile was much, much bigger. But she did that definitely out of a spirit of collaboration and people helping people. And you can't help everyone and you can't say yes to everyone either. So kind of those boundaries are really important. But I think I have seen, since we have sort of started Amazing If and been in Amazing If more full time, kind of running it as a company, you do start to sense there are those people who just have a real giving mindset, where their first thought is, how can I help, or how can I be helpful? And that's not just in what they say, it is in what they do. And there are definitely people who helped us where, when you sort of think, I'm not sure really what's in it for them, and probably, to be honest, not that much. They're just being helpful because they can, and they believe in that spirit of collaboration over competition. And I think that helped me to understand as well this point about going, it's not a sort of win-lose game you're trying to play. It's a also, do you feel good about yourself at the end of the day? And have you spent your time in a way that you feel proud of. And you also do come across people who I think don't take that approach, and I've seen that too. I've seen that, you know, where people might use your work and not credit it, and I always find that really hard to take. Or they might clearly copy what you've done and then they don't kind of make reference to it. Or, you know, maybe they say no to things and you think, oh, I really wish they'd say yes to that. But I think you also have to learn, a bit like you have to learn to let go of comparison. I think you have to learn to let go of that as well, because it's only you that's getting frustrated or angry. And that's been new for me, that sort of letting go of some of those emotions is not really something I experienced in corporate world. I think it's very different when you run your own company, and when you know, obviously really care about it and you've created it from scratch. Your sense of connection to that company is different. And I loved the companies, and particularly some of the people that I worked for. And I wouldn't say that everyone should run their own company or that it's always a bed of roses, because it absolutely isn't. I can talk about lots of examples of why to not do what we do, but certainly that kind of sense of just how much you care about it has been a surprise to me. So I have had to learn to let things go in new ways as well.
What do they say? Copying is the finest form of flattery.
Yeah, as long as they credit you, I would say would be the way, which you can tell, like it does. I do find that frustrating, but equally you have to learn to let it go. Once I remember Carolyn McCall, who's now, at the time she was the chief executive of EasyJet and she now runs ITV. She once said to me, you should have a 24-hour rule where if you're like me and you're a thinker, so I'm a thinker and stuff stays in my head for ages, and you can already tell, talk to me, I'm like, I remember stuff. And I can get quite angry, and I'm actually quite pragmatic. I'm not particularly emotional, but things like that really essentially wind me up. And she was like, you've got to have a 24-hour rule, because she has to cope with way more demanding and complicated things certainly than I ever have to in my day to day. And her thing was, if something kind of gets on your nerves or you get really angry or you're kind of worried about it, you've got to give yourself 24 hours. And then at that point, you write down one thing that you've learned from it. And at that point, you've got to let it go. She was like, learn and let it go. So, but what I quite like about that is, the reason I think that's good advice is you are allowed 24 hours. So I'm like, I sort of, if you just said to me, you've got to learn and let it go straight away, I think that would be unrealistic for me. So I've got to have a little bit of time to just dwell on something or mull something over, or to be annoyed, whatever that might be. Obviously at those points, don't write the emails, don't speak to anyone, because you'll never show up at your best. But you can allow yourself to sort of feel those emotions. But then after that, like, let's say something happened to me at midday today, I go, well, okay, but at midday tomorrow, I'm just going to write down one thing I learned, so get it out of my head by writing it down. And at that point, I'm going to choose to let it go, because I know it's not helpful for me, and it's taking up headspace that I need for other stuff. Do I do that perfectly all the time? Of course I don't. But I do always remember that advice, and she gave me that advice quite a long time ago. It wasn't even personal to me. I was sitting in a room with like 7 or 8 other people, but it always stuck with me, I think, because I have continued to find it helpful.
Yeah, I love that. There's this quote apparently by Buddha, but who knows, that said anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, because it's probably not eating them up in the same way that it is.
I mean, it absolutely isn't. And I sort of know that rationally, but emotionally, yeah, it has been really. I definitely that difference in terms of corporate world and running your own company world, I have never felt that way in corporate world ever. Like I could always be pretty pragmatic. I'm pretty level-headed as a person generally, but I think it's probably that sense of connection and things feeling more personal that has been newer to me. And also, this is where I am so glad that I have a co-founder, because she just laughs at me, and that actually really helps. I think not taking yourself too seriously and knowing each other at their best and at their worst. Like Helen, my co-founder, knows that and can see that happening sometimes, and then she can just find it funny, and she doesn't have that reaction. She is a very run your own race person. I don't really see her get angry. She gets frustrated sometimes at some things, like we all do running our own company, but she doesn't have that kind of comparison thing. That's not her things. Her things to work on are different to my things, so that's then really helpful, because you can give people nice nudges, we call them, like give you a nice nudge just to be like, Sarah, don't keep dwelling on that because it's not helpful. You're like, yeah, okay, you're probably right. And you can laugh, and you can sort of, if you don't find the fun in things, I think you can lose that sense of why you're doing it in the first place. So I am always very grateful to have her by my side. She definitely makes me better.
Oh, that's nice. Your work wife. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the journey to starting Amazing If. When did you get that sort of like, oh my gosh, this personal development, career development stuff is just lighting me up? And tell us about those early days when you started to bring it to life, when you didn't really have much of a clue what you were doing, because I think it's such an important story to tell, because that's where everybody starts, right?
Yeah, I mean, we had got no intention to start a business. I think we had an idea and we had time, importantly. So Helen and I, we've known each other for a long time, for sort of 23, 24 years now. We met at university and we were just friends for a long time, but we were working in the same city. So we're both based in London, in about 2012, 2013. And we just started talking about career development. We were both in completely different industries. And I did sort of draw this sort of staircase to squiggle diagram. And I was like, oh, it feels like our careers are getting way more squiggly. The teams that we're leading feels like they're kind of all squiggly. And we just sort of use this squiggly word without sort of really thinking about it too much. The bit actually that we really cared about was the how, was, well, how could we help people navigate these more squiggly careers, which was sort of a hypothesis at the time, in a really practical way, because we recognized that we had some incredible development, but it was very much accessible for a few people, definitely not for everybody. Sometimes it was dependent on the level that you were at in an organization, or if you were defined in a certain group of potential or whatever it might be. And then we just ran these workshops, like really randomly, mainly just for people that we knew. Like all we tried to do was like cover the cost of hiring this venue. We drew from day one, so we've never used a PowerPoint slide in 10 years or whatever it will be now next year. We've never used a PowerPoint slide for the work that we do. We always draw. We're very ideas and tools and practical focused. So I think like now you'd look back at it and call it like we were just experimenting. I don't even think we were doing that. I think we were finding a reason and a shared sort of enthusiasm sort of for something where we could spend time together. I think part of it was an excuse to spend time together, and we found that we were good at it, and we enjoyed it. It was just once a month. We always really enjoyed it. It was always on a Monday. I always really remember, like after work, we'd meet in a little coffee shop beforehand, just check we knew what we were doing for the workshop, go in, run it for 90 minutes, walk away. Great, we'll do another one next month. And so we just did that for ages, and enjoyed doing that. And it was just something a bit different, where you've got loads of freedom. You know, in a bigger organization, you've got a job to do and more defined ways of doing it. So I love that sense of like, oh, I can just do what I want and do it however I want to do it. And I loved co-creating with Helen. And at the time, neither of us have got kids. We had got a lot of, certainly in hindsight, space and freedom to sort of spend our time however we wanted to. So we just chose to do that for a while. And, you know, that then led to a few of the people coming to those workshops and saying, well, would you come and do this in our company? And we were a bit like, well, not really, because we've both got day jobs. And yeah, we've both got quite big, full-on day jobs as well. But we did take holiday. So we did take some holiday every so often and go and do work in companies. We never sort of hid it from the organisation we were working for. I think they just thought we were like, it was just weird. They were just like, it's just a random thing that they go off and do. And we didn't do it very often. But I do remember once doing like the Sainsbury's AGM, and then like the next day, like flying off to Poland or something to do some training for Diageo, and just being like, but actually quite enjoying it. It was all quite exciting. And I've got no responsibility, so it's perfect. It was fine. So we just did that. And then we started our podcast, which again, no one really listened to. That was fine, because it was just a reason to chat every week. We were going to do 10 originally, and then we were like, oh, should we just keep going? And so we just did. And we've sort of just done it in the same way for the last 3 and a bit years. And it's always just mainly been Helen and I chatting to each other. We occasionally have some guests along the way. So we just started that. We did look at early days we were like, oh, could we write a book? Would that be interesting? Could we turn our workshop content into a book? Nobody wanted to publish that book. Lots of people were like, we don't really get the squiggly careers thing. We don't
didn't you publish like the Confidence Gremlins one? Didn't you self-publish that as well, that book?
Well, yeah. So we had an early version of the squiggly career, the book that we did publish. We had an early version of that we tried, that we sort of spoke to some publishers about, some agents, and it was complete like no go. Or some people sort of said they were really interested and then they weren't really, which again I didn't rate. That was me starting to realise I was going to get way more emotional about things that we were very connected to. So yeah, that sort of went nowhere. We were like, oh, okay, that's fine. We'll just sort of, maybe we'll write it anyway one day. We'll just put it on the back burner for now. But then we had got this work that we'd done for the first 10 podcasts on how to overcome your confidence gremlins. So I was like, well, maybe just write that up. Would I describe it as a book? Yeah, just about. It's an illustrated book. So we worked with a brilliant illustrator who kind of brought these gremlins to life. And then essentially we sort of summarized the podcast episodes in terms of what's the gremlin, how to get in your way, what are some actions that you could take. And that was, and then we just got it printed. And so we did sell it. I'm pretty sure. I'm trying to think back now because it's a long time ago, it's probably 10 years ago. I think we put it on Amazon for a bit. And then just literally, I think I remember like, we were just putting them in the post to some people. It wasn't self-published in the way that I think now people are really smart about self-publishing. So certainly we are not a model of like how to do that well. And I think there are some, there's lots of really good advice about that now about, I think you can self-publish and it can be brilliant. I think it was our way of consolidating what we knew in a way that felt shareable and easy to sort of give to people. But it was a really good practice for then when we did go on to write our first book. And also I think again we just really enjoyed the process. I think that's one of the pieces of advice I'd always give to anyone who's starting something for themselves. You've got to enjoy the day to day. You've got to enjoy the process and each week. And yeah, there'll be hard moments, but if you're in it for the payoff, I think it must be very hard because you sort of lose the sense of joy and getting to play and have fun and creating your own thing. And I'm like quite nostalgic for some of those early days where like you've got so much space when you're first starting something. That's like the really, really fun bit. And actually Helen and I still work really hard today to make sure that we have that, because we haven't had it as much in the last couple of years. Some of that is pandemic based, but some of that's just because now we're a bit bigger and we've got more things that we have to do or that we're committed to. And I think sort of always remembering that sense of why you're in it and what you're trying to do and you at your best. And we are at our best often when we're kind of creating useful career development content, whether that's a podcast or a book or a workshop, and doing that together, like, when we're kind of better together. So yeah, that's sort of how it was very organic. There was no master plan, and it took a long time for either of us to really feel we were in a position or even wanted to run Amazing If as a company. A long time, at least 6 or 7 years, I would say.
Amazing. Love that. I one of the concepts I teach is called follow the scent. And I think that is an amazing example of you following the scent. There was something that you enjoyed. There was something that you want to explore. This was something you were curious about. You wanted to spend more time together. So you just started doing more of this thing. And then as you did that, a window opened up over here. So you went to Poland, and then you were like, oh, should we just follow this scent by sniffing out a podcast? And then you enjoyed that. So you kept going. And that's what I always encourage people to do. And I think it's couched in joy. It has to be couched in joy, because if you're doing this in your spare time and you're not getting paid for it, you need to be having a lot of fun while you're doing it. And it doesn't mean there aren't difficult moments, but inherently it's the stuff that lights you up. Otherwise, you're not going to keep going. So thank you for embodying that example so brilliantly. But then there came a point where Amazing If went from a passion project to becoming more of a full-time, in inverted commas, proper business.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that transition? Because it is an important transition that then means that you're taking this thing that you're passionate about to the next level. You're actually paying the mortgage.
Yeah. So we, first of all, definitely waited until it could pay the mortgage. People don't talk about money very often, but for Helen and I, that was a complete non-negotiable. We needed to be able to pay ourselves from day one. There was no runway of, oh, we're going to pay ourselves after a year, or, that point about, oh, we're in it, we're not going to pay ourselves and we're going to hope there's a really big payoff. Absolutely not. From day one, we both paid ourselves like a monthly salary, to be honest, as if you were back in a company, because we needed to, because we've got mortgages. By that point, we both got kids, so we'd got really high childcare costs because we're based in the UK where childcare is very expensive. And so we didn't also go into Amazing If at the same time. So Helen actually left her job at Microsoft before I left my job. I was working as a managing director for a creative agency, and I wasn't that long into that role, so I wasn't quite ready. Helen just happened to be at the point where I think she was thinking about other roles or moves that she could make within Microsoft, and I think she sort of thought, do you know what, I actually think I'd really like to give Amazing If a go. She was sort of ready from a kind of mindset and like where she was in terms of her career. And so we just worked out that we could afford her for a year. We were like, right, okay, Helen. And at that point, I got no expectation about what that then meant for me, but it was, okay, well, we can pay you for a year, Helen. See how you get on. And it was literally as kind of basic as that. And if you'd have asked me, I would have always said it would have been me that would go first. I think I felt like I'd always got more of the sense of being that person who kind of quite enjoyed that space to create and to be running your own thing. Whereas Helen was incredible in big organizations. I think I was kind of good enough, but she was brilliant. And so she was opting out of something she was already really good at. And then what happened is the minute she went into Amazing If, and then she put all of her incredible energy and focus and make it happenness into Amazing If, suddenly we were a business, because she was going out and talking to people, she was making opportunities happen and talking to companies about how we could help them with career development. And so suddenly she was sort of building this business almost single-handedly. Obviously then I got jealous, and I was like, oh, but I want to join in. And at that point I think it was okay to have a little bit of jealousy, but it took me a little while. I think I could have gone a bit sooner. And I had a really important moment actually with a lady called Lisa Thomas, who was working for Virgin, I think, at the time, which also ironically Helen had worked at. So that's how I knew Lisa. And I saw Lisa Thomas at an event, and we were just getting a cup of tea, and before we were going to sit down and listen to someone talk. And Lisa knew me a bit, but Lisa asks really good questions, is quite direct. And she sort of that day, and I've talked about it since, and she sort of doesn't really realise, but sometimes someone has a really pivotal impact on you. They don't really know it, but for you it makes a really big difference. And she just said to me, so how's Amazing If going? So I said a few things. She was like, so why are you not doing that for your role, and what's stopping you from making that move? And when someone asks you some really confronting questions, it's sort of literally as you're pouring a cup of tea. And then I sort of remember walking out the building that day and thinking, I haven't really got a good answer to that. I haven't got a good practical answer to that. I'm essentially a bit scared, I think, and a bit worried about what letting go of all of my corporate identity might mean. Are people still going to talk to me? And I don't know, I'd worked really hard to do the jobs that I was doing. And so it sort of felt, I was like, what does that mean to be letting go of all of that stuff that I've worked really hard for? But when she asked basically what's stopping you, I was like, the only thing that's stopping me now is actually myself. So it's not money, because the money's there if I want it. I could resign from my job. I know that company will be fine. They've got great people. They're not so reliant on me. So I was like, oh, okay, quite confronting. And that it was that day and that question that made me, I then rang Helen on Euston Road or whatever it is, near Euston Station. And I was like, oh yeah, I think now might be the time. And pragmatic as Helen always is, she was like, yeah, great, let's just sort that out. And then I transitioned quite slowly and steadily. So actually, to make sure that the company I was working for were going to be okay. And it wasn't until January 2020 that we were both full-time in Amazing If. And we had about 9 or 10 weeks running the company full-time before the pandemic hit.
Mic drop. All right. So Amazing If has come a long way. If you didn't listen and hear the amazing stuff in the intro, then, amazing podcast, TED Talk, huge, you've hired lots of people, it's really thriving. What do you think is the secret to the success that you've seen? Can we borrow some of it?
I think the reason it's been successful is we tested a lot, slightly more by accident than design, but lots of businesses fail because the supply and the demand don't work. So you might know what you want to supply, but is the demand there to make it a viable business? And of course, businesses have to change. Our business had to change through the pandemic. But I think we knew by the time we were both in the company full time, that what we wanted to give was going to be useful for other people. You don't know how much, you don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but did I feel that people wanted to buy what we'd got to sell? Yes. And had we seen that happen? Yes. So I wasn't guessing. And sometimes I think people sort of shy away from that because it feels a bit transactional, but that's how you create a viable business. People have got to buy what you want to sell. And so we knew that, and we tested that enough. And so I think that also meant that we got good cash flow. So when the pandemic hit 9 or 10 weeks after being full time in Amazing If, and for a while that meant our business sort of ground to a halt, essentially, certainly commercially, we were okay. It's like we were okay for a bit, and we managed to kind of bounce back quite quickly, which was great, but it didn't put too much kind of pressure on us. So I'd say one bit to definitely borrow is, if you have got an idea for a business, if you've got something you want to do everything that you can to like just start testing it. Don't think about testing it, test it, kind of do rather than think about doing, and just get it out there. Don't worry about it being perfect. Like, progress is kind of way more important. Like, just take a real kind of prototyping mindset. And I think the other bit of borrowed brilliance, and this is specific to me, I guess, because I know lots of people who don't do it this way and have been very successful, but I can't imagine ever running a business by myself. So the fact that Helen and I do it together, I think that means you get the highs and the lows together, which is very helpful. Also, we found the more we've worked together, the more different we have realized that we both are. And that's also really helpful. So though we definitely have a shared sense of purpose and values and just get on very well as friends, Helen's very extrovert, I'm way more introverted. Even sort of potentially how we'd approach decisions and problem solving is different, and that means there's more friction. The more different you are, there's more friction along the way, but we have definitely found our way through. Like, how do you resolve that friction? How do you, in those kind of tenser moments, what does that look like? How do you find your way through that? But I think if you can find collaborators, it's always helpful, because people bring different things. You don't have to have a co-founder. Maybe you have collaborators who are more kind of like a informal advisory board, or maybe you just have people who are doing informal mentoring, or you just surround yourself with people who you just know are making you better. Because people often describe running your own business as being lonely. I'm never lonely because I've got a co-founder, but also I do find now I rely on some of my peers from previous companies, because I do miss that sense of being part of a leadership team, because I liked being in a leadership team. And I had one particular leadership team that I think was the epitome of a high trust, high performing team. They were exceptional, and they're all in incredibly brilliant jobs now, doing great jobs. They're the leaders that we want to see in our organizations. So they are my very good friends, but also they are very good advisors. I borrow their brilliance when I get a bit stuck. If I need some commercial advice, if I want someone to have a look at some strategy stuff, I feel like they sort of act as well as being my friends. I sort of have additional duties in terms of being my go-to gurus sort of when I need them. So I guess the advice isn't necessarily to get a co-founder. The advice is to make sure you've got the right people around you.
Yeah, I agree. I think I work on my own, and it can feel lonely, but you can recreate that sense of team by putting those structures in place. Like, I always try and have at least one friendly one-to-one a day where I might take them for a walk and just have that sort of water cooler moment, as it were. And I think, it is all about making sure that you have a sellable product, and you won't know that at the beginning, but you'll never know that until you put it into action, and creating those prototypes, or I call them MVPs, minimum viable product. This podcast is an example of that. I'm not doing lots of fancy stuff. I'm just trying it, putting it out there and seeing what happens. It doesn't all need to be amazingly perfect. Progress, not perfection, is a term that our lovely Laura always likes to, our lovely friend Laura, who's also on the podcast, shared with me. Okay, let's talk about some of the tougher moments. Can you tell us a bit more about the bits where you've been in a flood of tears, or you've thrown your computer against the wall, or the equivalent such scenarios, and remind us that it's not all a bed of roses out there?
Well, it definitely isn't. That's definitely true. I think the pandemic was hard for Helen and I at times, because we had to write our second book, You Coach You, pretty remotely. I say pretty remotely, 99% remotely. And that meant that when And that was okay, because we write, you know, we don't sit and write together or anything. Like, I will write a chapter, I'll send it to Helen, she'll red pen it, she'll send it back to me, we'll talk about it, and you kind of develop it that way. So in lots of ways, writing a book remotely is fine, until you get to a chapter where you then have some really big challenges with a chapter. So we had one particular chapter, which ironically was on relationships, where we got ourselves in a bit of a mess in terms of what that chapter was going to have in it. We really disagreed, and essentially what we were doing is, I was writing one version, Helen was sort of then writing another, I'd sort of ignore that and then write another, and that's just, you're sort of going around in a not very helpful loop. And we were also getting quite frustrated with each other. And by that point, we'd been, you know, you'd been in the pandemic for quite a long time, not seen each other for a long time. You're getting tired. You're having to work. We were both working quite a lot. And it's sort of all, you know, like you get that perfect storm of like probably the pandemic, plus how, you know, you're on a deadline because you're writing a book. You get a chapter that's not right. And we both knew it wasn't right, but you're like, I'm not even sure I've got the energy to make it right. And then you're sort of having arguments at either end of the day about it. So I'd wake up to like messages from her, because she's an early bird, telling me that it wasn't right and she's not happy. And then I'd be sending her messages late at night going, it's not right, I'm not happy. And you can't just get in a room and sort it out, which we'd always before been able to get in a room and sort it out. So I remember that feeling hard. But back to that point about, I think Helen has a great phrase where she says, you've got to fix friction fast. And I am definitely someone who loves to bottle stuff up, like just generally, that's my personality. But Helen doesn't, and that's helpful, because I would probably just be like, I would start to dwell on it and it like fester. If friction festers, I think that's when people like explode, or you do things that you really regret. Whereas actually what we have got good at in those hard moments is calling it. I think you've got to name it and go, this feels hard. It's okay. Like we're pretty good now, both of us, at saying, this feels hard. Okay, let's just stop. Like, why is it feeling hard? What's wrong? Why are we going around in circles? And you've got to fix the friction, which is not about sorting the chapter. You've got to figure out first, like, what's causing all the problems here? Is it the way that we're working? Is it we've got different points of view? It's been working until now, so why is it suddenly not working? Yeah, that's quite interesting. We're not doing anything differently. So, yeah, what is causing these problems? And that's when you start to realize, like, okay, well, we were like, you know, when you're starting to run on empty, we were like running on empty a bit. We needed to take a bit of a break. And actually what that prompted us to do is, for the first time ever, I remember emailing our editor at Penguin and saying, right, we need more time. Like, we're not prepared to do a substandard. We've got a chapter, but we're not happy with it. We're not prepared to do a substandard chapter, so we need more time. And funnily enough, we were both quite worried about that, because we always just sort of stuck to our deadlines. And then our editor was like, yeah, it's absolutely fine. You're probably the only authors we've got who actually stick to their deadlines. And we were like, oh, okay. So I'd been really stressing about the fact that we might not stick to the deadlines. It turned out it was absolutely fine. And so it prompted us to send that email, which just gave us the space. Then we could have the conversation about, well, what are we trying to do? What is good about it? And I think in those moments, you've got to zoom out. So you've got to, you know, we both got quite attached to different parts of that chapter, and you're caring too much. So then you've got to leave it for a few days, and then you've got to come back and go, right, regardless of who's done what is good about it, what we're going to throw away, let's just get it to a point where we feel really happy with it. And what I find so interesting about that is when people tell me some of their favorite chapters in You Coach You, the relationship one always comes up. And it always makes me smile, because I always think, I'm so glad that we didn't just go, oh, it's good enough, because I didn't want it to just be good enough. I wanted it all to be as great as we could possibly make it. And then I always feel proud that we sort of found our way through that difficult moment, where it's probably the closest we have come to actually like almost like going falling out, which just felt like you're a bit like back at school. But I think we got there in the end. But I think I've realized it is okay to not agree, and it is okay to have that friction. It's also okay to need a bit of space from each other some of the time. But I think now that we've been through some of those harder moments, I have confidence that there is nothing that we couldn't find our way through together, because that is just one of many. I've given you one example. There's practicing our TED talk where we had to stand in the rain, in the freezing cold, in a park in Margate, shouting our TED talk at each other because we couldn't get close to each other. The first time we did our TED talk properly next to each other was in Abbey Road Studios recording it. And you're like, that's pretty tough. to do for a TED Talk. You know, so probably the last couple of years, I mean, I wouldn't wish the last couple of years on any of us for lots of reasons, but I think it has certainly demonstrated that we have the resilience that we need to find our way through some pretty hard moments at times. And then that helps to give me confidence that we're kind of in it for the next 10 years, the next 20 years.
Yeah, if you survive those tough things, you're going to survive the next tough thing.
Yeah.
All right, Sarah, it's been so fab to have you. Last question, please. Your best piece of career advice?
Never live the same year twice.
Short and sweet. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.